The morning started like any other Tuesday at Windsor Castle. The sun was just beginning to peek through the ancient stone walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Birds chirped in the royal gardens, and the usual morning routine was well underway. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Officer James Thornton stood at his post near the main gate, sipping his third cup of tea. He'd been a royal guard for 15 years now, and he knew every inch of this place like the back of his hand. At 42 years old, he'd seen plenty of strange things during his time here. Foreign dignitaries arriving late, tourists trying to sneak in, even the occasional confused delivery driver. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. His radio crackled to life at exactly 9:47 a.m. The voice on the other end sounded urgent, almost panicked. "All units, we have an unscheduled motorcade approaching from the east entrance. Multiple vehicles moving fast. This is not a drill." James felt his stomach tighten. Unscheduled arrivals were never good news. They either meant someone had messed up the paperwork or something more serious was happening. He immediately signaled to his fellow guards and moved toward the gate control room. Through the security cameras, he could see them coming. A line of big black SUVs, the kind you see in movies about American presidents. They were moving quickly, too quickly for a normal diplomatic visit. The lead vehicle had small American flags mounted on the hood. James counted 6 vehicles in total, all identical, all with tinted windows so dark you couldn't see inside. His supervisor, Captain Reynolds, rushed into the control room. The captain was an older man, close to retirement, with gray hair and a face that had seen everything. But even he looked concerned. "What do we know?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," James replied. "They weren't on today's schedule. I've checked 3 times. The only American visit we have logged is for 11:30 a.m., and that's supposed to be a small delegation, not a full motorcade." The vehicles were getting closer. James could hear the rumble of their engines now. Standard protocol was clear in situations like this. No vehicle enters the castle grounds without proper clearance and verification. It didn't matter if the Queen herself was inside those cars. Rules were rules, and they existed for good reasons. "Stop them at the gate," Captain Reynolds ordered. "Full security protocol. I'll contact the palace office and find out what's going on." James nodded and headed outside. His heart was beating faster now. This was the part of the job that kept you on your toes. You never knew what might happen next. He signaled to 4 other guards to join him. They took up positions around the gate, their faces serious and professional. The lead SUV pulled up just inches from the gate. The engine was still running, a low, powerful rumble. For a moment, nobody moved. It was like a standoff in an old Western movie. Except this was very real, and this was Windsor Castle. James approached the driver's side window. He kept his hand near his radio, ready to call for backup if needed. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in a dark suit with an earpiece. American Secret Service, James thought immediately. You could always tell by the way they held themselves, alert and ready for anything. "Good morning," James said in his most professional voice. "I'm Officer Thornton with the Royal Guard. I'm going to need to see your authorization papers for this visit." The Secret Service agent didn't smile. "We're running ahead of schedule. We have a VIP who needs to proceed to the castle immediately. This is a matter of diplomatic importance." "I understand that, sir," James replied calmly. "But I still need to see proper documentation. No vehicle enters these grounds without clearance. I'm sure you understand our security concerns." The agent's jaw tightened. "Look, we don't have time for this. Make a call to whoever you need to call, but we need to move now." James didn't budge. 15 years of training and experience had taught him one thing above all else. Never let anyone push you around, no matter who they are. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn off your engine and step out of the vehicle. All occupants will need to be identified before we can proceed." That's when things got interesting. The doors of all 6 SUVs opened almost simultaneously. Men in dark suits poured out, at least 20 of them. They didn't draw weapons or make threats, but their message was clear. They were not happy about this delay. The lead agent approached James. "Officer, I need you to understand something. We have former President Donald Trump in the 3rd vehicle. He's here for an official visit to meet with members of the royal family. This delay is creating a security risk." James felt his mouth go dry. "Trump? Here, now?" He glanced back at the gate control room and saw Captain Reynolds on the phone, probably calling every senior official he could think of. This was way above James's pay grade, but he was the one standing at the gate right now. "With all due respect," James said, keeping his voice steady, "that doesn't change our protocol. The visit isn't scheduled for another hour and a half. We need to verify everything before anyone enters." More royal guards were arriving now, forming a perimeter around the vehicles. This was turning into a situation. James could see faces appearing in the castle windows. Staff members were watching. Someone had probably already called the media because he could hear a helicopter in the distance getting closer. Through the tinted window of the third SUV, James caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was inside, probably making phone calls, probably very angry about being stopped at the gate. He couldn't blame them, really. But this was his job. This was what he was trained to do. The American agents were conferring among themselves now, speaking in low voices. One of them was on his phone, probably calling the American embassy. This was becoming an international incident, and it was happening right in front of James's eyes. Captain Reynolds came out of the control room, walking quickly. His face was red, either from stress or anger, maybe both. "We've got a problem," he said quietly to James. "The palace office says they have no record of any early arrival. The scheduled visit isn't supposed to start for 90 minutes. Nobody knows why they're here early, and nobody authorized this motorcade to approach the castle." James felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. Why would a former president show up hours early without warning? Why all the secrecy? Why the rush? "Sir, what do you want me to do?" James asked. Captain Reynolds looked at the motorcade, then back at the castle, then at James. "We follow protocol. Full security check. Every vehicle. I don't care who's inside. If they want to enter Windsor Castle, they follow our rules." The standoff was officially underway. News helicopters were circling overhead now. James could see reporters gathering outside the outer perimeter, cameras already rolling. Whatever happened next would be watched by millions of people around the world. And somewhere in that third SUV, behind those dark-tinted windows, a former American president was waiting. The question was, why had he really come here early, and what was about to happen that would shock everyone at the palace? The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. James stood his ground, watching as more Secret Service agents gathered around the lead vehicle. They were talking into their radios, their faces serious and focused. This wasn't going the way they had planned, and they clearly weren't used to being told no. One of the senior agents, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. His badge identified him as Agent Richards, head of the security detail. He approached Captain Reynolds directly, bypassing James altogether. "Captain, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. We have a former president of the United States in our care. Every minute we sit here exposed is a security risk." Captain Reynolds crossed his arms. "Agent Richards, I need you to understand something as well. This is Windsor Castle. We have our own security protocols that have kept the royal family safe for centuries. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, enters these grounds without proper clearance." "We have clearance," Richards insisted. "We're scheduled for a visit today." "You're scheduled for 11:30, Reynolds countered. "It's barely past 10 o'clock. That's not just being a little early. That's arriving hours ahead of time without notification. Surely you can understand why that raises concerns." James watched the exchange, impressed by his captain's calm demeanor. This was diplomacy in action. But it was also a battle of wills. Neither man wanted to back down, and neither man could afford to. The helicopter noise was getting louder. James counted at least 3 news choppers now, maybe 4. This was going to be all over the television within minutes. He could already imagine the headlines. "Royal Guard stops Trump at Castle Gate." His mother was probably going to see this on the news before he even got home. Suddenly, the door of the third SUV opened. Everyone tensed. The Secret Service agents immediately moved to form a protective circle. James felt his hand instinctively move toward his radio. This was it. The moment that would define how this whole situation played out. A figure emerged from the vehicle, and even from a distance, James recognized him immediately. Donald Trump looked exactly like he did on television, maybe a bit older, but still with that distinctive appearance. He was wearing a dark blue suit and a red tie. He didn't look happy. Trump said something to his agents, then pulled out his phone. He started making calls right there in the open, pacing back and forth beside the SUV. Even from where James stood, he could tell these weren't casual conversations. Trump's gestures were animated, his expression intense. He was calling in favors, pulling strings, trying to make this gate open through sheer force of will and political connections. "This is getting out of hand," Captain Reynolds muttered. He turned to James. "Get on the radio. I want 12 more guards here in the next 2 minutes. And get me someone from the palace office who can make decisions. We need answers, and we need them now." James nodded and started making calls. Within minutes, the scene transformed. More royal guards arrived, taking up positions around the perimeter. A palace official's car pulled up from inside the castle grounds, and a nervous-looking man in a suit jumped out. He was carrying a tablet and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. The palace official, introduced as Mr. Peterson from the Diplomatic Affairs Office, immediately started trying to smooth things over. Gentlemen, I'm sure we can resolve this situation quickly. Perhaps if we need a full security inspection," Captain Reynolds interrupted. "That's non-negotiable." Agent Richards shook his head firmly. "That's not going to happen. We have our own security protocols. The president's vehicle is not subject to foreign inspection." "Former president," Reynolds corrected. "And if that vehicle wants to enter this castle, it absolutely is subject to our inspection." Trump ended another phone call and walked toward the group. His Secret Service detail immediately moved with him, maintaining their protective formation. Everyone watched as he approached. James had never been this close to anyone so famous before. It was surreal. "What seems to be the problem here?" Trump asked, his voice carrying that familiar tone James had heard in countless interviews and speeches. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. "Mr. President, we have standard security protocols for all visitors to Windsor Castle. Your early arrival wasn't on our schedule, and we need to conduct a security verification before we can allow entry." Trump looked around at the gathered guards. The helicopters overhead, the cameras in the distance. "This is ridiculous. I've been to Windsor Castle before. I've met the Queen. This is completely unnecessary and frankly quite embarrassing for both our countries." "Sir, I understand your frustration," Reynolds replied calmly. "But our protocols exist for everyone's safety, including yours. We just need to verify the vehicles and occupants, and then we can proceed." "How long will that take?" 15, maybe 20 minutes if everyone cooperates." Trump looked at Agent Richards, who gave a subtle shake of his head. The message was clear. The Secret Service didn't want anyone looking inside those vehicles. That made James even more curious. What were they hiding? Or were they just being overly cautious about security? The standoff continued for another 10 minutes. Phone calls were made. Palace officials conferred with government ministers. The American embassy got involved. Meanwhile, the news helicopters circled overhead, and the crowd of reporters outside the gates grew larger. James noticed something interesting during all this. The agents around the third SUV seemed particularly protective. While the other vehicles had their doors open and agents standing casually nearby, the third vehicle remained tightly guarded. Every time one of the royal guards even glanced in that direction, an agent would step into their line of sight. "Captain," James said quietly, pulling Reynolds aside, "something's different about that third vehicle. They're protecting it more than the others." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I noticed that too, which means that's where we need to look." More negotiations followed. Mr. Peterson from the palace office was sweating now, despite the cool morning air. He was caught between protocol and diplomacy, between following rules and avoiding an international incident. James almost felt sorry for him. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, a compromise was reached. The Secret Service would allow a limited inspection of the vehicles. They would open the cargo areas for visual examination, but would not allow any of the vehicles to be touched or moved. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Captain Reynolds assigned the inspection team. He looked at James. "Thornton, you started this. You're going to finish it. You and Officer Davis will conduct the inspection. Be thorough but respectful. And whatever you find, you report directly to me. Understood?" "Yes, sir," James replied, his heart pounding. He was about to inspect a former president's motorcade. This was either going to be the highlight of his career or the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Officer Davis, a younger guard with only 5 years of experience, looked nervous. "Have you ever done anything like this before?" he asked James. "Never," James admitted. "But there's a first time for everything." They approached the first vehicle. The Secret Service agents watched their every move, their faces expressionless but their eyes alert. This was going to be interesting, James thought. Very interesting indeed. And he had no idea that what he was about to discover would change everything. James pulled on a pair of inspection gloves, more for formality than anything else. Officer Davis did the same, though his hands were shaking slightly. They approached the first SUV, where an agent stood with his arms crossed, clearly unhappy about the situation. "We'll start with a visual inspection of the cargo area," James explained. "We won't touch anything unless necessary." The agent nodded curtly and opened the rear hatch. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. Security equipment, communications gear, first aid supplies, and what looked like emergency response tools. Everything was neatly organized and secured. James made notes on his clipboard while Davis took photos with an official camera. The second vehicle was similar. More equipment, some luggage, nothing unusual. The agents were cooperative but tense, watching every move the guards made. James understood their position. They were responsible for protecting a high-profile individual, and having foreign security personnel inspect their vehicles went against everything they were trained to do. Then they reached the third vehicle. The one that had been most heavily guarded. The one where Trump had been sitting. James noticed immediately that the agents around this vehicle were different. They stood closer, their body language more defensive. Agent Richards himself stepped forward. "This vehicle requires special care. There are sensitive materials inside related to diplomatic purposes." "I understand," James replied. "We'll be respectful." Richards hesitated, then nodded to one of his men. The rear hatch opened slowly. At first glance, it looked similar to the others. Security equipment, bags, the usual items. But then James noticed something pushed toward the back, covered with a dark blanket. "What's under the blanket?" he asked. "Personal items belonging to the president," Richards answered. "Nothing that concerns security." "I'll need to verify that," James said, keeping his voice professional but firm. Richards exchanged glances with his fellow agents. For a moment, James thought they might refuse. But Captain Reynolds was watching from a distance, and Trump himself was still on his phone nearby. The agents must have decided that cooperation was the better option. "Fine," Richards said. "But be careful. The items are valuable." Officer Davis pulled back the blanket slowly. Underneath was a wooden crate, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was made of dark, polished wood with metal reinforcements at the corners. And right there on the top, clear as day, was a seal. Not just any seal, but one James recognized immediately from his years working at the castle. It was the seal of Buckingham Palace Archives. James felt his breath catch. He looked at Davis, whose eyes had gone wide. They both knew what this meant. This wasn't just unusual. This was potentially serious. "What is this crate?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "As I said, personal items," Richards replied. But something in his tone had changed. He sounded defensive now. "This crate has the Buckingham Palace seal on it," James pointed out. "These aren't personal items. These are official royal property, or at least they should be." Richards's jaw tightened. The president purchased those items legally through an auction house in New York. Everything is documented and above board. Captain Reynolds had noticed the commotion and was walking over quickly. Other guards were gathering around, curious about what had been found. The atmosphere had shifted from tense to genuinely concerning. "Open it," Reynolds ordered. "That's not necessary," Richards protested. "I have all the documentation right here." He pulled out a folder from inside the vehicle. "Purchase receipts, authentication papers, everything you need." "Open it anyway," Reynolds repeated. "I want to see what's inside." After another tense moment, one of the agents carefully unlatched the crate. The lid opened with a soft creak. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, were several items. James could see the edges of old papers, what looked like leather-bound documents, and something that might have been a painting or portrait. Captain Reynolds leaned in for a closer look, being careful not to touch anything. His face went pale. "Get Dr. Whitmore on the phone," he said quietly to one of the nearby guards. "Right now." "Who's Dr. Whitmore?" Agent Richards asked. "She's the master of the Queen's Archives," Reynolds replied, "an expert in royal historical documents. And unless I'm very mistaken, what you have in this crate shouldn't exist outside of palace walls." James felt a chill run down his spine. This was bigger than just a scheduling mix-up or a security protocol issue. This was about historical artifacts, royal property, and questions that needed urgent answers. Trump had finished his phone call and was walking back toward the group. He could clearly see that something had happened. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Why is everyone gathered around that vehicle?" Captain Reynolds turned to face him. "Mr. President, we've discovered some items in your possession that bear the Buckingham Palace seal. Items that appear to be historical documents and artifacts. I'm going to need you to explain where these came from and why you're bringing them to Windsor Castle." Trump looked at the open crate, then at Richards, then back at Reynolds. For just a moment, James saw something flash across his face. Not quite surprise, but maybe frustration that his plan had been disrupted. "Those items were purchased legally," Trump said firmly. "We have all the documentation. We were bringing them here as a gift, to return them to the royal family. It was supposed to be a surprise." "A surprise?" Reynolds repeated skeptically. "You bought royal artifacts at an auction and decided to return them as a surprise?" "That's exactly right," Trump confirmed. "My team discovered them at an auction house in Manhattan 3 months ago. We recognized they were British, possibly royal property, so we purchased them with the intention of returning them. I thought it would be a meaningful gesture, something to strengthen the relationship between our countries." It sounded plausible, James thought. Maybe even noble. But something about the timing, the secrecy, the early arrival, it all felt off. Why not coordinate this properly through official channels? Why all the mystery? Mr. Peterson, the palace official, was now frantically making phone calls. He was talking to someone senior, probably explaining the situation and asking for guidance. This was well beyond his authority to handle. Dr. Whitmore arrived 20 minutes later in a palace car. She was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing glasses and carrying a leather satchel. She looked like exactly what she was, a serious academic who took her work very seriously. Reynolds briefed her quickly on what they'd found. She listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions, then approached the crate. She pulled on white cotton gloves from her satchel and carefully lifted one of the wrapped items. The courtyard went silent as she unwrapped it. It was a document, yellowed with age, covered in old-fashioned handwriting. She studied it for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she picked up another item and another. Finally, she looked up at Reynolds, and James could see shock in her eyes. "These are authentic," she said quietly. 18th century correspondence, royal portraits, possibly some letters from King George III himself. And if I'm not mistaken, these are the items that went missing from our collection in 2019. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. Stolen items? This had just become much more serious than anyone had imagined. Trump stepped forward. "They weren't stolen. We bought them legitimately. We have receipts, authentication papers, everything. We're trying to return them to their rightful owners." "That may be true," Dr. Whitmore said carefully. "But these items were reported as stolen property 4 years ago. How they ended up in an American auction house is a question that needs urgent investigation." James looked around at the scene. News helicopters still circled overhead. Cameras were recording everything. The American Secret Service agents looked worried. Trump looked frustrated. Captain Reynolds looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour, and somewhere in that wooden crate lay answers to questions nobody had even known to ask. Questions about theft, about international art trade, about how historical treasures disappeared and reappeared thousands of miles away. This was no longer just about security protocols or scheduling conflicts. This was about something much bigger, much more complicated, and potentially much more explosive. The real investigation was about to begin. Within minutes of Dr. Whitmore's announcement, everything changed. What had been a tense standoff became an all-out emergency response. Palace security went into high alert mode. More officials arrived, their faces serious and concerned. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was about stolen royal property, international law, and a situation that could become a massive scandal. James watched as Dr. Whitmore carefully photographed each item in the crate. She worked with intense focus, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. Every few minutes she would pause and shake her head, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Captain Reynolds was on his radio constantly, coordinating with higher authorities. James caught fragments of conversations. "Yes, confirmed authentic. No, we don't know the full story yet. Right, keeping everything secure. Understood. Nobody leaves until we have answers. Trump had been moved to a waiting area inside the gate, still surrounded by his Secret Service detail. He looked frustrated but was cooperating. Agent Richards stayed close to the crate, watching the examination like a hawk. The tension between the American and British security teams was thick enough to cut. A black sedan with government plates pulled up fast, tires crunching on the gravel. Out stepped a man James recognized from television, Lord Ashworth, one of the senior advisors to the royal household. He was known for being calm under pressure, but even he looked stressed as he surveyed the scene. "Someone brief me," Lord Ashworth demanded, his voice carrying authority. "And I want facts, not speculation." Captain Reynolds stepped forward and explained everything: the early arrival, the inspection, the discovery of the crate, Dr. Whitmore's identification of the stolen items. Lord Ashworth listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Reynolds finished, Lord Ashworth turned to Dr. Whitmore. "You're absolutely certain these are the missing items from 2019? "I can't be 100% certain without laboratory analysis," she replied carefully. "But I've worked with the Royal Collection for 30 years. I know these pieces. I was part of the team that reported them missing. The letters have distinctive characteristics: the paper type, the handwriting, the royal seals. The portrait miniatures have specific details that match our records. I would stake my professional reputation on it. And they've been missing for 4 years?" "Yes, my lord. They disappeared from a secure storage facility in 2019. We conducted an extensive investigation. The theft was never solved, and we assumed the items were lost forever, possibly destroyed." Lord Ashworth rubbed his temples like he had a headache coming on. "And now they turn up in an American motorcade. This is going to be a nightmare." He looked over at Trump. "We need to interview him properly, and I want lawyers present, British and American." The next hour was a flurry of activity. More officials arrived. Lawyers from both governments showed up. Someone brought tea and coffee, though James doubted anyone was really in the mood for refreshments. The news helicopters had been joined by more media, and James could see satellite trucks setting up outside the outer perimeter. Mr. Peterson, the palace official who'd looked nervous earlier, now looked like he might actually faint. He was juggling phone calls, trying to manage press inquiries, and attempting to coordinate with various government departments. James felt genuinely sorry for the man. This was probably the worst day of his career. Dr. Whitmore had set up a temporary examination area inside one of the guardhouses. She was going through the items methodically, cataloging everything. James, still on security duty, was close enough to hear her commentary. "This letter is from King George III to Lord North, dated 1775, she murmured to her assistant, who was taking notes. "It discusses the situation in the American colonies. Historically significant. This one, oh my goodness, this is correspondence about the Boston Tea Party. This belongs in a museum, not in a storage crate." She picked up another document, unfolding it carefully. Personal letter from the king to his son. Private family matters. These were never meant to be seen by the public. Her voice carried a mixture of wonder and sadness. Someone stole pieces of history, pieces that belonged to everyone, and sold them for profit. A younger assistant who'd arrived with her asked, "How much would these be worth?" "On the black market? Impossible to say. To collectors, to museums, to historians, priceless. You can't put a value on primary historical documents from this period. Each of these letters gives us a window into the past, into decisions that shape the modern world." James found himself fascinated despite the tension of the situation. He'd worked at Windsor Castle for 15 years, walking past historical artifacts every day, but he'd never really thought about their significance. Now, listening to Dr. Whitmore, he understood why this was such a big deal. Meanwhile, in another building, Trump was being interviewed. James wasn't present for that, but Officer Davis was assigned to stand guard outside the room, and he later shared some details. Trump had been cooperative, explaining how his team discovered the items at a Manhattan auction house called Heritage Collectibles. He said they paid $2.3 million for the collection, believing them to be legally available historical items. The American legal team had brought documentation, auction catalogs, authentication certificates from American historians, payment receipts, even correspondence with the auction house. Everything appeared legitimate from the American side. They'd done their due diligence, verified the item's authenticity, and purchased them through normal channels. But that raised an obvious question. How did stolen British royal artifacts end up in a legitimate American auction house? That question brought in another wave of officials. Interpol was contacted. The Metropolitan Police Art Theft Division was notified. Someone from the FBI's art crime team was being flown in from London. This was becoming an international investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. James took a break around 2 p.m., grabbing a sandwich from the staff canteen. Other guards were buzzing with excitement and speculation. Everyone had theories about what had happened, though nobody really knew the full story yet. "I heard Trump stole them himself," one young guard said. "Don't be stupid," another replied. "Why would he steal them just to return them? That makes no sense. Maybe it's a publicity stunt, or maybe someone's trying to set him up." James didn't join the speculation. He'd learned over the years that jumping to conclusions was a good way to look foolish later. Better to wait for facts. When he returned to his post, he saw Dr. Whitmore talking intently with Lord Ashworth. She was showing him something on her tablet, and his expression was grim. James couldn't hear the conversation, but he could tell it wasn't good news. Later that afternoon, a breakthrough came. The auction house in New York had been contacted by investigators. They were cooperating fully and had provided their records. The items had been consigned to them by a private collector in 2023, who had purchased them from someone else in 2021. They had authentication papers that seemed legitimate. The auction house claimed they had no idea the items were stolen property. That set off a chain of investigation working backward. Who was the 2023 seller? Where did the 2021 buyer get them? How did they get from Windsor Castle to the black market, to legitimate collectors to an auction house? Meanwhile, the media coverage was intensifying. James saw the news on a monitor in the control room. Headlines scrolled across the screen. Trump stopped at Windsor Castle. Stolen royal artifacts discovered. International incident at palace gates. Some reports were accurate. Many were wildly speculative. All of them were getting millions of views. Inside the palace, emergency meetings were happening at the highest levels. Should they press charges? Against whom? Trump appeared to be an innocent buyer, but the items were stolen property. What were the legal implications? What about diplomatic relations? This could affect US-UK relationships if handled poorly. James saw various officials coming and going, their faces showing the stress of trying to navigate this impossible situation. This wasn't just about recovering stolen property. It was about politics, diplomacy, international law, and public perception. As the sun began to set on what had been an incredibly long day, James realized this was far from over. The discovery at the gate was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, figuring out exactly what had happened, who was responsible, and how to resolve it without causing an international crisis. Dr. Whitmore was still working, carefully preserving each item. Lord Ashworth was still in meetings. Trump was still waiting, though he'd been moved to more comfortable quarters inside the castle. The lawyers were still arguing about jurisdiction and legal precedent, and James was still at his post, the guard who'd started this whole thing by simply doing his job. He wondered how this would all end. Would they ever find out who really stole the items? Would anyone be arrested? Would Trump face consequences, or would he be cleared? One thing was certain: this story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. By early evening, a formal meeting room had been set up inside Windsor Castle. It wasn't the grand staterooms used for official ceremonies, but a practical conference room normally used for administrative meetings. The atmosphere was tense but more organized than the chaos earlier at the gate. Trump sat at one end of a long table, flanked by his lawyers and Agent Richards. Across from him were Lord Ashworth, Captain Reynolds, Dr. Whitmore, representatives from the British government, and legal advisors. James stood guard near the door along with Officer Davis. They weren't part of the conversation, but their presence was required for security. "Let me start by saying I came here with good intentions," Trump began, his voice calm but firm. "Everything I'm about to tell you is documented. We have receipts, we have emails, we have authentication reports. This isn't some mystery. It's all on paper." Lord Ashworth nodded. "We're listening, Mr. President. Please explain from the beginning." Trump leaned back in his chair. "It started about 3 months ago. My personal assistant was browsing through an auction catalog from Heritage Collectibles in Manhattan. It's a high-end auction house, very reputable, been around for decades. They specialize in historical documents and artifacts. He pulled out a tablet and scrolled through some images. She noticed this lot. British royal correspondence, 18th century. Letters, documents, some portrait miniatures. The catalog description mentioned King George III, colonial matters, that kind of thing. She knows I'm interested in history, especially anything related to the Revolutionary War period, so she brought it to my attention. One of the British lawyers interrupted. "And you decided to buy them?" "Not immediately," Trump replied. "First we did our homework. I'm not going to spend over $2 million without knowing exactly what I'm getting. We hired 3 different experts to authenticate the items. All 3 confirmed they were genuine 18th century documents." Dr. Whitmore spoke up. "Who are these experts?" Trump's lawyer provided a list of names. James watched as Dr. Whitmore pulled out her phone and started making notes. She would obviously be checking these credentials later. "Once we knew they were authentic," Trump continued, "I asked my team to research where they came from. Not just who was selling them, but their history. That's when things got interesting." He looked directly at Lord Ashworth. "My researchers discovered that similar items had been reported missing from the royal collection in 2019. They found news articles about the theft. They found your public appeals for information. And they realized these might be the stolen items. And you still bought them?" Lord Ashworth asked, his tone skeptical. "I bought them because they were being sold legally through a legitimate auction house," Trump explained. "The auction house had paperwork showing a clean chain of ownership. From their perspective, these were legally acquired items. If I hadn't bought them, someone else would have. They might have ended up in a private collection somewhere, locked away forever. At least this way they could come home." One of the British officials leaned forward. "So you're claiming you bought stolen property with the intention of returning it?" "That's exactly what I'm claiming," Trump confirmed. "Because that's exactly what happened. I saw an opportunity to do something good, something that would benefit both countries. These items belong in Britain. They're part of your history. So I bought them with the explicit purpose of bringing them back." James had to admit it sounded convincing, but there were still questions. Why the secrecy? Why arrive early? Why not coordinate this properly through official channels? As if reading his mind, Lord Ashworth asked, "Why didn't you simply contact the British government? Why all this cloak and dagger approach?" Trump smiled slightly. "Because I wanted it to be special. Look, I know my relationship with some members of the British establishment has been complicated. I thought this could be a moment to change that, a genuine gesture of goodwill. I imagined arriving at the official visit, having this reveal moment presenting these items to the royal family. A photo opportunity, yes, but also something meaningful." "The early arrival?" Captain Reynolds asked. "Security concern," Agent Richards interjected. "We received intelligence about potential protests planned for the official arrival time. Nothing serious, but we didn't want to take chances. We decided to arrive early, get Mr. Trump safely inside, and wait there for the scheduled meeting time. Why not notify us of the change?" Reynolds pressed. "We tried," Richards said. "We contacted the American embassy 2 hours ago. They were supposed to notify your office. Apparently that message didn't get through in time." Mr. Peterson, the palace official, looked mortified. "We did receive a call from the embassy, but it came through to the wrong department. By the time it was redirected to security, the motorcade was already at the gates." Lord Ashworth sighed. "So this is a combination of good intentions, security concerns, and bureaucratic miscommunication?" "That's about the size of it," Trump agreed. "Look, I understand why you're skeptical. I understand why this looks suspicious. But I'm telling you the truth. We have every piece of documentation you could want. Authentication reports, purchase receipts, correspondence with the auction house, research notes from my team. Everything is available for your review." Dr. Whitmore had been quiet for a while, studying her tablet. Now she looked up. "I've been looking at the names of your authentication experts. 2 of them are well-respected historians. The third is a known appraiser who works frequently with auction houses. Their credentials check out." "Thank you," Trump said. "I don't hire amateurs. If I'm going to spend $2.3 million on historical documents, I want to know exactly what I'm getting." One of Trump's lawyers spread out documents on the table. "These are copies of everything related to the purchase. The original auction listing, authentication certificates, payment records, email correspondence with Heritage Collectibles, even the research notes that identified these as potentially the stolen Windsor items." The British legal team began examining the papers. James could see them passing documents back and forth, making notes, occasionally whispering to each other. This was going to take time to verify, but at first glance everything seemed legitimate. There's still the question of how stolen items ended up in a legitimate auction house, Lord Ashworth pointed out. That's a serious concern. Absolutely, Trump agreed. And that's something your investigators need to look into. Heritage Collectibles claims they received these items from a private collector who had proper provenance documentation. But obviously somewhere in that chain something went wrong. Someone lied about where these items came from. Dr. Whitmore was making notes furiously. We'll need to interview the auction house staff. Get their records. Trace the ownership chain backward as far as possible. This could take weeks, possibly months. We're prepared to cooperate fully, Trump's lawyer said. Mr. Trump wants these items returned to their rightful owners. He wants to be seen as someone who helped recover stolen property, not as someone who complicated the situation. James noticed something interesting in Trump's demeanor. He wasn't defensive or aggressive, which is what James might have expected. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to be explaining himself, like he'd been waiting for this opportunity to tell his side of the story. What happens now? Trump asked. I assume you're keeping the items. That's fine. That's what we wanted anyway. But what about the rest of my visit? I'm still scheduled to meet with several officials. Are we moving forward with that? Or has this incident changed everything? Lord Ashworth exchanged glances with the other British officials. That's going to require some discussion. This situation is complicated. We need time to verify your story, investigate the auction house, trace the ownership chain. We can't just accept everything at face value, regardless of your intentions. I understand, Trump said. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Well, actually, I have a hotel reservation in London, but you know what I mean. There was a brief moment of tension-breaking laughter. Even in this serious situation, Trump knew how to work a room. James had to give him that. The meeting continued for another hour, going over details, clarifying timeline questions, discussing next steps. Legal experts debated jurisdiction questions. Dr. Whitmore asked detailed questions about the authentication process. Captain Reynolds wanted to know more about the security intelligence that prompted the early arrival. Through it all, Trump remained consistent in his story. He'd bought stolen property unknowingly through a legitimate channel. He'd discovered they were stolen and decided to return them. He'd wanted it to be a grand gesture, but had ended up creating an international incident instead. Was it true? James didn't know. But he had to admit it was plausible. The documentation seemed legitimate. The experts Trump had hired were real. The purchase had happened through proper channels. Maybe this really was just a well-intentioned plan that had gone wrong. Or maybe there was still more to the story that nobody had discovered yet. Only time and investigation would tell. The investigation kicked into high gear the next morning. James reported for his regular shift to find Windsor Castle buzzing with activity. Investigators from multiple agencies had set up temporary offices. The Metropolitan Police Art and Antiques Unit had sent their top detectives. Interpol had assigned a specialist team. Even the FBI had sent someone from their London office to assist. Dr. Whitmore had essentially taken over a section of the castle library, transforming it into a forensic examination center. James walked past around 8 a.m. and saw her surrounded by high-tech equipment, digital microscopes, special lighting for examining documents, computers running analysis software. She looked like she hadn't slept. Officer Thornton, she called out when she saw him. Do you have a moment? James stepped into the room. The historical documents were laid out on special examination tables, each one carefully protected under glass. How's it going, Doctor? Fascinating, she said, her eyes bright despite obvious exhaustion. These items are absolutely genuine. I've examined the paper composition, the ink chemistry, the writing style, even the wax seals. Everything checks out. These are authentic 18th century royal documents. So Trump was telling the truth about that part? About the authenticity? Absolutely. These are the real deal. I've even found catalog references matching them to our records from before they disappeared. No question about it. These are the items stolen from Windsor in 2019. What about the rest of his story? Dr. Whitmore pulled off her examination gloves. That's where things get complicated. Come, let me show you something. She led him to a computer screen displaying what looked like auction records. This is from Heritage Collectibles in Manhattan. The items were listed in their spring catalog this year. Exactly as Trump said, the auction happened in June. Purchase price, $2.3 million paid by a company registered to Trump's organization. So that part's true too? It appears to be. I've spoken with the auction house director. They're cooperating fully with investigators. They claim they had no idea these were stolen items. The consignor provided provenance documents that seemed legitimate. James looked at the documents on screen. Who was the consignor? That's the interesting part. The items were consigned by a man named Robert Mitchell, a British antique dealer based in Edinburgh. He claimed he purchased them from a private estate sale in 2021. Have they talked to him? Police are trying to locate him now. His shop in Edinburgh closed 6 months ago. His phone is disconnected. His last known address is empty. He's essentially disappeared. That sounded suspicious. James frowned. So he's probably the thief? Possibly. Or he's a middleman who knew he was dealing in stolen property. Or he's another innocent party in a longer chain. We don't know yet. Dr. Whitmore pulled up more files. But here's what we've pieced together so far. She showed James a timeline on her screen. The items disappeared from Windsor storage in March 2019. Security footage showed someone entering the facility, but the cameras were conveniently malfunctioning that day. Inside job we always suspected. Do you know who? We had suspects but never enough evidence to charge anyone. The investigation went cold after 6 months. She pointed to the next entry on the timeline. Then nothing until 2021, when Robert Mitchell supposedly purchased them from an estate sale. He provided documentation of this sale to Heritage Collectibles. But the estate sale was fake? We're checking that now. The estate Mitchell claimed to buy from did have a sale in 2021, but their records show no sale of 18th century royal documents. Either Mitchell forged the provenance or someone at the estate was in on it. James was starting to see how complicated this was. So these items could have passed through multiple hands with each person thinking they were legitimate? Exactly. That's how the black market often works. Stolen items get laundered through fake sales, forged documents until they appear clean. By the time they reach someone like Trump, the paper trail looks legitimate. Over the next few days, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Detective Inspector Harrison from the Met's Art Unit was leading the investigation. James saw him around the castle frequently, always on his phone or interviewing someone. Harrison managed to track down some useful information. The estate sale Mitchell had referenced was run by a company that had since gone bankrupt. However, investigators found the former owner, a man named Peter Walsh. When questioned, Walsh insisted he had never handled any royal documents. His records backed this up. So Mitchell definitely forged the provenance, Harrison explained during a briefing James attended. He created fake purchase documents to make it look like he'd bought the items legitimately. Heritage Collectibles accepted these documents in good faith. What about the original theft? Lord Ashworth asked. Any progress there? Harrison nodded. We've reopened that case, going back through the old evidence with fresh eyes. We're looking particularly closely at former palace employees who had access to the storage facility. It turned out there was a break in that direction too. A former archives assistant named Colin Drake had left his position abruptly in April 2019, just weeks after the theft. At the time, it hadn't seemed connected. He'd claimed family reasons for leaving. But now investigators took a closer look. Drake had moved to Scotland shortly after leaving Windsor, to Edinburgh specifically. And according to bank records, he'd made several large cash deposits in 2019 and 2020, despite being unemployed. We think Drake stole the items and sold them to Mitchell, Harrison explained. Mitchell probably paid him cash over time, explaining the deposits. Mitchell then sat on the items for a couple years, letting the heat die down, before selling them through the American auction house. Why America? Someone asked. Distance, different jurisdiction, less chance of British authorities noticing. Mitchell probably thought they'd disappear into a private collection somewhere. He didn't count on someone recognizing them and trying to return them. The investigation into Drake and Mitchell continued. Interpol issued international alerts. Police in Scotland were searching for both men, neither of whom could be located. They'd both seemingly vanished. Meanwhile, the authentication of Trump's documents continued. His lawyers provided everything they'd promised. Emails with the auction house, correspondence with authentication experts, research notes, payment records. Everything checked out. Trump's story is holding up, Dr. Whitmore told James one afternoon. His team really did do their homework. They identified these as potentially the stolen Windsor items. They documented everything, and from what I can see, his intention was genuinely to return them. So he's in the clear? Legally? That's for the lawyers to sort out. But from a moral standpoint, it seems like he was trying to do the right thing, just in a very complicated way. The British government had to make some difficult decisions. Trump had purchased stolen property, but unknowingly and through legitimate channels. The items needed to be returned to the royal collection. But what about Trump's $2.3 million? Should he be compensated? That money had ultimately gone to criminals. After much debate, a solution was worked out. The British government would compensate Trump for his purchase price. They would then pursue legal action against Heritage Collectibles to recover that money, since the auction house had sold stolen property. Heritage Collectibles had insurance for exactly this kind of situation. It's not perfect, Lord Ashworth admitted during a meeting James overheard. But it's fair. Trump gets his money back. We get our property back. The auction house's insurance covers the loss, and we continue pursuing the actual criminals. As for Heritage Collectibles, they were mortified. Their reputation was built on selling legitimate historical items. The idea that they'd been duped into selling stolen royal artifacts was devastating. They'd immediately hired their own investigators to review their vetting procedures. We were victims too, their director said in a public statement. We were deceived by forged provenance documents. We're cooperating fully with all investigations and have already implemented stricter verification procedures. By the end of the week, the basic facts were clear. Trump had bought the items in good faith. The theft had been an inside job by Colin Drake. Robert Mitchell had laundered the items through fake documentation. Both men were now fugitives. James found himself impressed by how thorough the investigation had been. Every claim had been verified. Every document checked. Every person interviewed. The truth had emerged piece by piece, and it was more complicated than anyone had initially thought. You know what this shows? Dr. Whitmore said to James one evening as she was packing up her equipment. It shows why we have protocols, why we check things carefully. If you hadn't stopped that motorcade, if you hadn't insisted on inspecting the vehicles, these items might have been returned quietly, and we'd never have learned the full story. We wouldn't know about Drake or Mitchell. We couldn't pursue them for the crime. James hadn't thought about it that way. I was just doing my job. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed, she smiled. Just someone doing their job properly, even when it's difficult. The investigation would continue for months, tracking down Drake and Mitchell, prosecuting them if caught. But the main mystery was solved. The items were recovered. The story exploded across global media within hours of the initial incident. James first realized how big it had become when his phone started buzzing nonstop with messages from friends and family. His mother called worried. His sister sent him a screenshot of a news headline with his name in it. His old school friends were texting, "Are you famous now?" The coverage was everywhere. Television news channels ran it as their top story. Newspapers put it on the front page. Social media was absolutely on fire with discussions, debates, and countless memes. Everyone had an opinion and nobody was shy about sharing it. The narratives varied wildly depending on which outlet you watched. James started keeping track, fascinated by how differently the same event could be portrayed. Some American news channels painted Trump as a hero. "Former president returned stolen treasures to Britain," read one headline. These stories emphasized the $2.3 million purchase, the authentication efforts, the intention to return the items. They showed clips of Trump explaining his actions, looking dignified and thoughtful. Commentary praised him for strengthening international relations and recovering historical artifacts. "This is what leadership looks like," one commentator said, "recognizing something valuable, taking action, and doing the right thing." President Trump saw stolen British property and made sure it got home. That's character. Other American outlets took the exact opposite view. "Trump's British blunder creates international incident," said another headline. These stories focused on the unscheduled arrival, the confrontation at the gates, the chaos it caused. They questioned why he hadn't coordinated properly through official channels. "This is typical Trump," one analyst said. "He can't just do things the normal way. Everything has to be dramatic, everything has to be about him. He could have quietly worked through diplomatic channels, but instead he created a spectacle. British media was equally divided. The tabloids had a field day. "Royal Guard stops Trump at Castle Gate," screamed one paper. "What they found inside will shock you," said another. The coverage was breathless and sensational, with speculation running wild before all the facts were known. More serious British newspapers took a measured approach. Stolen royal artifacts recovered after 4 years focused on the historical significance. Complex investigation underway into royal collection theft examined the criminal angle. These stories were less interested in Trump's role and more focused on how the items had been stolen and recovered. The British public opinion was fascinating to watch. Some people praised Trump for returning the items. "Fair play to him," one man on the street interview showed. "He could have kept them. Instead, he brought them back. Can't fault that." Others were more skeptical. "Seems like a publicity stunt to me," another person said. "Why all the drama? Why not just work through proper channels?" Social media was where things got really interesting. Within hours, hashtags were trending. Yangsang's Trump at Windsor, men's royal artifacts, Yan's Castlegate. The memes came fast and furious. Someone created a video game mock-up. "Royal Guard Simulator, stop the motorcade." Another person made a cartoon showing James as a superhero stopping a convoy of vehicles. There were jokes, serious political discussions, conspiracy theories, and everything in between. "I bet Trump stole them himself and is returning them for publicity," one tweet claimed, getting thousands of likes despite being obviously wrong. "This proves Trump cares about history and international relations," countered. Another popular post, "Can we talk about how that Royal Guard just did his job even with all that pressure? That's the real story here," said another tweet that James particularly appreciated. His role in the story became a subplot of its own. "Meet James Thornton, the guard who stopped Trump," ran one feature article. They dug up his background: 15 years of service. Military veteran before joining the Royal Guard, father of 2. Lived quietly in a suburb outside London. James found himself in the weird position of being both anonymous and famous. News articles mentioned him by name, but most people wouldn't recognize him on the street. Still, at work, he couldn't go anywhere without someone bringing it up. "Seen yourself on Twitter?" Officer Davis asked one morning, showing James his phone. Someone had created a Chad Royal Guard meme using what was presumably James's silhouette. "Follows protocol, doesn't care who you are," the caption read. International reactions added another layer to the coverage. French media portrayed it as another episode in the complicated US-UK relationship. German outlets focused on the art theft angle, comparing it to other famous cases of stolen cultural property. Australian news mostly found it amusing. Only in Britain, former president stopped at Castle Gate. Conservative political commentators generally praised Trump. This shows his respect for history and international friendship, they argued. Liberal commentators were skeptical. "This is a PR stunt that conveniently diverts from his legal troubles," they countered. Historical experts weighed in. "These documents are incredibly significant," one historian explained on television. "Letters from King George III about the American colonies, right during the Revolutionary War period. They provide insights into British thinking at a crucial time. Their recovery is genuinely important." Art theft specialists discussed how stolen antiquities entered the legitimate market. "This case is actually quite typical," one expert said. "Items get stolen, sit for a few years, then emerge with forged provenance. Auction houses can be fooled if the paperwork looks good. That's why verification is so crucial." Legal experts debated the implications. Trump purchased stolen property but unknowingly through legitimate channels. What's his legal standing? They discussed. Can he be compensated? Should he be? These are complicated questions with no easy answers. Some coverage focused on the auction house. "How did Heritage Collectibles miss this?" asked one investigation. They looked into the company's vetting procedures, their authentication process, their history. The auction house's reputation took a hit, even though they'd been fooled like everyone else. The story had legs, as journalists say. It kept developing with each new revelation. When investigators identified Colin Drake as a suspect, that became a new headline. "Former palace employee suspected in royal theft." When Robert Mitchell was revealed as the middleman, another wave of coverage followed. The human interest angles were endless. Stories about Dr. Whitmore, the expert who dedicated her career to preserving royal history. Features about the royal guards and their protocols. Profiles of the investigators tracking down the criminals. Everyone involved became part of the narrative. Public fascination remained high for days. Morning talk shows discussed it. Late-night comedians made jokes about it. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to analyzing every angle. The story had everything: history, royalty, a famous personality, crime, international intrigue. It was irresistible to media of all types. James watched some of the coverage in disbelief. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was wildly speculative. Some reports claimed things that hadn't happened at all. He learned quickly that you couldn't believe everything you saw on television or read online. His family struggled with the attention. His mother worried about his safety. His kids thought it was cool that their dad was famous, though James tried to downplay it. His wife mostly just wanted everything to return to normal. The British government had to deal with constant press inquiries. Mr. Peterson, the palace official who'd been caught in the middle of everything, became the unofficial spokesman. James felt sorry for him, having to field questions about diplomatic procedures and legal complexities when all he'd wanted was a quiet administrative career. As days passed, the intensity gradually decreased. New stories emerged to capture public attention. The 24-hour news cycle moved on. But the story didn't disappear entirely. It remained a point of reference, something people brought up in discussions about art theft, diplomatic relations, or Trump's public image. "You'll always be the guy who stopped Trump at Windsor Castle," Officer Davis told James one day. James shrugged. "I was just doing my job, following protocols, checking vehicles, nothing special." "Maybe that's exactly why the story resonated," Davis suggested. "In a world where everything's complicated and political, you just did your job properly. People appreciate that." Maybe he was right. Maybe in all the noise and speculation and hot takes, the simple truth was what mattered. Someone did their job, followed the rules, and accidentally uncovered something important. The media would keep talking. Commentators would keep analyzing. Social media would keep debating. But for James, it was time to move on. There were still gates to guard, protocols to follow, and regular days of work ahead, though he had to admit it had been quite a week. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the castle gates, Windsor Castle prepared for something quite different: a formal ceremony to officially return the recovered artifacts to the royal collection. The atmosphere was completely different from that chaotic Tuesday morning that had started everything. James stood at his post near the state apartments, watching dignitaries arrive. This time everything was scheduled, coordinated, and planned down to the minute. No surprises, no unscheduled motorcades, just a proper diplomatic event the way it was supposed to happen. The ceremony was held in the Waterloo Chamber, a grand room usually reserved for important state occasions. Rows of chairs had been set up facing a podium. British officials sat on one side, American diplomats on the other. Media cameras were positioned at the back, their presence approved and managed properly this time. Trump arrived right on schedule, this time with full coordination and proper security clearance. He was accompanied by the American ambassador, several diplomats, and of course his Secret Service detail. Agent Richards nodded to James as they passed. There was mutual respect there now, after the tension of that first encounter. The British side was represented by Lord Ashworth and several other senior officials. Dr. Whitmore was there too, looking much more rested than the last time James had seen her. She would be accepting the artifacts on behalf of the royal collection. The ceremony began with formal remarks from Lord Ashworth. He spoke about the significance of the recovered items, the importance of protecting cultural heritage, and the successful cooperation between British and American authorities in resolving the situation. "These documents and artifacts represent an important piece of our shared history," Lord Ashworth said. "They tell the story of a pivotal moment in time, when decisions made in these very halls shaped the future of nations. Their theft was a crime not just against the crown but against history itself. Their recovery is therefore a cause for celebration." He acknowledged the complicated circumstances. This recovery happened in an unconventional way. What began as a security concern became an investigation, which revealed both criminal activity and genuine good intentions. It's been a reminder that truth is often more complex than headlines suggest. Then Trump was invited to speak. He approached the podium, looking comfortable in the formal setting. Whatever you thought about his politics, James had to admit the man knew how to work a room. "I'm honored to be here today," Trump began. "Though I have to admit, this isn't quite how I imagined this moment going." There was polite laughter. "When my team discovered these artifacts in an auction catalog, I saw an opportunity to do something meaningful. Something that would honor the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain." He spoke about the purchase process, the authentication efforts, the research that identified them as stolen property. "I could have kept them. Legally, I'd purchased them through proper channels. But that wouldn't have been right. These pieces belong here in Britain, where they can be studied and appreciated by scholars and the public." Trump acknowledged the confusion of that morning. "I understand why the Royal Guard stopped our motorcade. Officer Thornton was doing his job, following protocols that exist for very good reasons. In fact, I want to thank him personally. His diligence led to a proper investigation, which uncovered the full story of how these items were stolen and how they traveled through the black market." James felt his face grow warm as attention briefly turned toward him. He maintained his professional composure, but inside he was startled to be mentioned directly. "The investigation also revealed something important," Trump continued. "The international art market has vulnerabilities that criminals exploit. Stolen cultural property can be laundered through forged documents until it appears legitimate. This case should be a wake-up call for auction houses, collectors, and governments to strengthen verification procedures." The American ambassador spoke next, discussing the cooperation between law enforcement agencies and expressing confidence in the ongoing investigation to locate the criminals involved. He announced that the FBI would continue assisting British authorities in tracking down Colin Drake and Robert Mitchell. Then came the moment everyone had gathered for. Dr. Whitmore approached a table where the artifacts had been carefully displayed under protective glass. One by one, she spoke about each item. "This letter from King George III to Lord North, dated October 1775, discusses strategy regarding the American colonies," she explained, her voice filled with academic enthusiasm. "This document provides crucial insights into British thinking during the Revolutionary War period." She moved to the next item. "These portrait miniatures represent members of the royal family who have largely been forgotten by popular history. Their recovery allows us to fill gaps in our understanding of the period." As she continued describing each piece, James realized something. These weren't just old papers and paintings. They were windows into the past. They were evidence of real people making real decisions that shaped the world. Protecting them wasn't just about following rules. It was about preserving knowledge for future generations. The formal transfer happened with appropriate ceremony. Documents were signed acknowledging the return of the property. Trump was presented with a certificate of appreciation from the royal household, thanking him for facilitating the recovery. Photographs were taken, handshakes exchanged. Everything proper and diplomatic. After the ceremony, there was a reception in another room. James remained on duty, but could observe the mingling of British and American officials, the conversations between diplomats, the careful dance of international relations. Captain Reynolds found James during a quiet moment. "You handled yourself well through all this, Thornton. From that first confrontation to now, you should be proud." "I was just doing my job, sir." "That's exactly why you should be proud. In a complicated situation with a lot of pressure, you did your job properly. That's what professionalism looks like." Reynolds paused. "I'm putting you in for a commendation. The royal household has already approved it. You'll receive official recognition for your actions." James was surprised. He hadn't expected any award. "Thank you, sir. Though honestly, I didn't do anything special." "That's where you're wrong. You did something very special. You followed protocols even when it was difficult. You didn't bend the rules because someone was famous or important. That kind of integrity is exactly what this job requires." As the reception continued, James thought about everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, he'd been having a normal Tuesday morning. Then a motorcade appeared, and suddenly he was in the middle of an international incident involving stolen royal artifacts, criminal investigations, and diplomatic complications. The investigation into Drake and Mitchell was ongoing. Interpol had several leads. Police in Scotland had found evidence linking Drake to the original theft. Mitchell's financial records showed suspicious transactions. It would take time, But there was confidence they would eventually be found and prosecuted. Heritage Collectibles had already implemented new verification procedures. They'd hired additional experts to review provenance documentation. They'd established relationships with law enforcement databases to check items against stolen property records. The incident had been embarrassing for them, but they'd responded professionally. The artifacts would soon go on public display. Dr. Whitmore was already planning an exhibition about their history, their theft, and their recovery. "It's important that people know the full story," she'd told James. "Not just what the documents say, but how they were lost and found. That's history too." Trump's official visit continued for 2 more days. He met with British officials, attended scheduled events, and gave several interviews about the artifact return. The coverage was generally positive. Even critics acknowledged that whatever his motivations, the outcome had been good. For James, life gradually returned to normal. The media attention faded. The news helicopters stopped circling. The unusual number of visitors at the castle decreased. He went back to regular shifts, regular duties, regular days. But something had changed. James looked at his job differently now. It wasn't just standing at gates and checking credentials. It was about protecting something important. History, culture, heritage, things that belonged to everyone and needed to be preserved. Officer Davis summed it up well one afternoon. "You know what I learned from all this? Rules matter. Protocols exist for reasons. Sometimes following them seems pointless or difficult. But this whole situation proved they're important." James agreed. If he'd waved that motorcade through, if he'd skipped the security check, those artifacts might have been returned quietly. The criminals would never have been identified. The full story would never have been known. Sometimes doing your job properly, even when it's hard, is exactly what's needed. Months would pass. The investigation would continue. Drake and Mitchell would eventually be found and brought to justice. The artifacts would be studied, displayed, appreciated by thousands of visitors. Books and articles would be written analyzing every aspect of the case. But for James Thornton, Royal Guard at Windsor Castle, the story was essentially over. He'd done his job, followed the protocols,